Okay, today I am joined by Hirra Khan, who's the co-director of the climate charity Possible. She was the head of Possible's Car-Free Cities program. She was also the trustee of the Women's Environmental Network until last year, and she is passionate about shaping a sustainable future centered around social justice and community cohesion. So thank you very much for coming on, Hira. It's really good to have you here. I've seen
Thanks,
you on the
Kat.
news and talking about car-free cities, so we can maybe get into that with how did you come to be interested in the environment and also like spend basically your full-time role talking about these issues and being and campaigning for these things.
I think I knew that there was an issue with the climate from a very young age. I was one of those lucky generation of people who, we were taught in school about recycling, about climate change, but there wasn't this sense of urgency. I don't think the term climate crisis was being used. I think we spoke about climate change. And it was just sort of in the background. So there was like an awareness, but very, not really a sense of urgency. And I think now, over the past sort of 30 years, that was me back in school, now 30 years later, I kind of question how anyone cannot be concerned about the environment, because we're really experiencing the effects of the climate crisis. It's very real for all of us. And even in Britain, which is actually fairly well insulated, we're already seeing flash flooding, droughts. We've had food shortages in supermarkets. Extreme high temperatures that, the UK is not made for. Our homes are really supposed to keep heat in. And now we're facing the issue of, oh my gosh, it's too hot. How do we get heat to go out? I think I would argue it's almost impossible to not be concerned about the environment. And, we've seen the British electorate now, poll after poll shows that it is in their top 5 issue consistently. And I think it makes it into top 3 or top 4 issue over the past few years. So climate is a concern for everyone, increasingly.
Okay, and so when did you really think about that this is something you want to really dedicate yourself towards? So you said from school it's more about in the background. It was just climate change, a thing that's happening. When did it become a crisis and you thought, okay, I need to really do something about it?
I'm going to be honest, I don't think I felt compelled to do anything about it. The angle that I came from to climate was from a health angle, a public health angle, and it was to do with air pollution. And particularly, I've been brought up in East London my whole life. I've lived in Tower Hamlets for the past 7 or 8 years. And for me, air pollution was the big issue. I live right by the A12. That's a main road, and it just has traffic coming through. I've seen the impact it has on my own health, as well as the people around me. And when I heard the stat that, children in Tower Hamlets have reduced lung capacity, which affects them throughout their whole life because they're growing up in this polluted area. So that's kind of what triggered me to be interested in the issue of traffic reduction. And that's when I started, working with Women's Environmental Network. I was a trustee there. And so they really link the issue of gender, health, and the climate crisis all together. And through that work, it wasn't just about air pollution. It was also about, plastic and what these large corporations put into feminine hygiene products, like period products, and how that's damaging women. It was about the food we eat and how that affects our, why isn't there cheap, healthy food available, and who benefits from that, and how that's affecting our health. So that was, I think, where I really got to grips with how the climate was intersecting with public health, but also on the ground people. And that's sort of where I guess I became more concerned. And then I think COVID-19 hit, and public health was super, like the biggest thing on the map. We were kind of looking at what happens when there's huge systems change, what happens in a pandemic, and how we can shift very, very quickly if and when we want to. And that's kind of the example I always use. You know, when something is an actual crisis, politicians start treating it like it's a crisis, and you know, a lot of our freedoms get removed. You don't have that choice anymore because we're in an emergency. And I don't know at what point we reach that level with the climate crisis. At what point do politicians start treating it actually like a crisis, where it's not up to people to decide anymore, like, you know, whether you want to drive around the corner because it's more convenient for you. It has real ramifications on everyone.
Yeah, I get the point about it being not being treated as a crisis, because it's happening fairly slowly compared to, like, let's say COVID, just in a year and 100,000 people are dead.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting about the London air pollution, because we used to live in Surrey long time ago, in Chesington, and I mean it's nowhere near, it's nothing like central London where you're from. But I had really bad eczema, and we moved to Birmingham, and it just went
Yeah.
immediately. I
Yeah.
mean, Birmingham itself is it's still the second biggest city, but it's nowhere near like London.
But Birmingham's also really polluted, and that's I think the issue with pollution is people, particularly in cities, people expect cities to be polluted. They kind of think, oh, that's just the way it is. But it's like, that's not, this is actually poisoning us, and it's not the way that it should be. And so the UK government was taken to court over the illegal levels of air pollution in our air and how they were basically doing nothing about it. And they lost. And so now that's why, you know, these clean air zones are being implemented in Birmingham. The clean air zone was implemented, and it's because the government was taken to court. And so now all of these local mayors and local authorities have to implement measures to reduce the amount of pollution in our air. But really, there is no level of pollution that's safe. You know, it's not like, hey, have just a little bit of poison, that's fine for you. It's that no level of pollution is safe, and we should fight to eradicate this from our air.
Yeah, I think in economics they'd call it an externality, which hasn't really been accounted for by the market, and we have to legislate.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, yeah. That you're head of the car-free cities program for Possible. Why car-free? Why not just like go electric? Like, there's a difference there, isn't it?
Yeah, there is a difference there, and it's a really good question. So before we even get to the climate, I think we should think about what's a city. And a city is a dense area that's really like densely populated. That's like, you know, where lots and lots of people live. And if everyone owns a car, if everyone owns an EV, you've already got a problem. And we've seen that in our cities. We've seen, you know, in Birmingham, in London, in Manchester, it's the problem everywhere. There's too many cars, there's congestion, there's traffic. It is an inefficient way to move a huge number of people around a city. So before you even think about the climate, it is not a good idea for everyone to have an EV. It's just not, because then everyone starts driving and then everyone's stuck, right? So in cities, the most efficient way to move people around is walking, and if you're in a wheelchair, wheeling, and cycling. You know, that is the space you take up is tiny. But if you're going about really far distances or much further distances, then of course trains, tubes, buses, and if you have mobility issues, then of course you may prefer to use those anyway. Those are the most efficient ways of moving people around a city. And then, so why are we talking about car free? So we talk about car free because to reach our climate goals, we need to see at least a 25% reduction in our car use at the moment. And to give you a bit of a context, over the past couple of years, we've made, you know, 1%, maybe 2% at that. But ultimately, we're not going fast enough. We need to see 25% by 2030. We're now, you know, coming towards the last quarter of 2023. So we've got about 6 and a bit years to go, and we've just not made enough progress. And the other thing about EVs is you can kind of click your fingers and all the cars we currently have will become EVs that, you know, would help solve the problem. But unfortunately, that's not the way it's going to work. And as we've seen, you know, by 2030, diesel and petrol cars, new car sales will be phased out. But second, most people, it's very rare that people are able to afford to buy brand new cars. Most people buy secondhand cars. And so those petrol and diesel cars will stay in the system for a lot longer, and they will still make up the majority of cars in the UK for a lot longer than 2030, because that's how you kind of phase out cars and old technology. So yeah, it's like we're not moving quick enough to kind of do the transition to EV. So what I'm basically saying is, yes, EVs for everything that should be electrified. And I think, you know, buses, ambulances, anyone who does have a personal car should be moving it to an EV. But ultimately, I want to see most people be able to get around their cities without a car. And, you know, there are very few, for most of us, I would say, aside from, you know, certain people who have certain jobs like carers, maybe some tradespeople, most cars sit unused 95% of the time. They're just parked. And they kind of, you make one journey, then it's parked for hours on end, then you make another one, then it's parked for hours on end. That, again, is a really inefficient way of getting about a city. It's sort of, it would be much better if you were able to hire a car for the period that you need it and then drop it off, and someone else can then use it for the period. And you know, we've seen it working with like bikes, we've seen it working with e-scooters. It happens. That's the kind of thinking we need to move to for cars. It should be a sharing model rather than an owning model. And the other thing I would say is, and I don't think I've really concentrated on this that much, and I don't see people talking about it that much, is the rise of the autonomous vehicle will mean, I think, makes the case for car ownership even weaker, because it's, why would you need to own a car when you're not even the one who's driving? You know, you're kind of, it's a vehicle that's kind of moving you about in the same way that a bus might do, or a cab might do. And therefore, I think it strengthens the argument for, you know, sharing vehicles.
Yeah, I think autonomous vehicles would be amazing, because then you can just subscribe to like a autonomous vehicle service, and then it eliminates Uber and taxi drivers, and that's also less traffic on the road, and then you just use the car when you need it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing I would say is, because people often point to taxi drivers and cab drivers as the people who are most affected by traffic reduction issues. And I would say, no, what's happened is a lot of gig economy platforms have come in and flooded the market and basically made taxis and cab users. I think it's watered down their pay, it's watered down their benefits. So now it is assumed that driving a car is a non-skilled job. And actually, I would argue it's a very skilled job. If you look at how many people die every year on the road, what we need to do is see, if most people didn't have a car, I would say they would rely more on cabbies and taxi drivers to get them about for the times when they need it. And I would like us to move towards a model where cab drivers are fairly paid and they get the you know, same benefits as staff. Whereas at the moment, you know, a lot of them are barely making minimum wage when they're on these gig economy platforms. You have to drive around for ages, spreading air pollution, trying to find work that and it's driven down wages. And that, I think, is another issue that you know, I think is overlooked too much in this.
Just about the point regarding bringing down the number of cars, isn't it only really possible in cities like London, where things are nearby? You've got an excellent public transport system, like you can go end to end to London like in very efficient times compared to a car. But other cities, like where I'm in Birmingham, for instance, if I live on the west side of Birmingham, my parents live on the east side in Solihull, and in a car it takes me about 30 minutes. If I were to get the bus, about an hour and a half. And then if I have to get train, which is, I have to get a bus to get the train, and then the train will go to New Street. The New Street will go to Stachford. And Stachford, there's no buses. I have to get picked up by a car anyway. And that will take an hour and a half as well.
Yeah.
So most cities haven't been designed in a way where public transport is a real priority and in an efficient way. And they've been designed for cars or just they've just made things on the fly as they've been developed. So isn't that the bigger cause of like preventing us from reducing our cars?
I mean, it absolutely is. But I think the key thing there is the use of the word designed, because it's a choice, right? It's been made to be like this, which implies it can be made to be like something else. And so when people talk about, cities like Amsterdam, where most of the population cycle to get about, Amsterdam was not Amsterdam in the 70s. If you go back and have a look at what Amsterdam was like in 1970s, it was car heaven all over again. They had to make these design choices to say, okay, we're not going to allow traffic here. We're going to make this a cycle path, a safe cycle path for people. And it's the same thing that's happening in Paris. Paris has seen a huge cycling revolution recently through their new mayor, Anne Hidalgo. And again, people talk about how wonderful it is now to cycle around Paris. It wasn't like that 20 years ago. She had to come in, build cycle lanes, put in the infrastructure to get people to cycle. And we're starting to see that happen in London. People talk about London has great public transport infrastructure. It sort of depends on where you are. South London, not so much, and there are huge areas in outer London, and that's kind of why the ULEZ expansion was so controversial. There are areas in outer London that are not that well connected, and it probably would feel very similar to being in a place like Birmingham, where there's your transport infrastructure is limited. You might have a few buses, but buses have experienced a lot of cuts recently. You might be waiting for hours. The place is designed for car use rather than alternatives. I think the learning, though, from London is, I don't know if people might remember Ken Livingstone introduced the congestion charge, a couple of decades ago now. And the congestion charge, the way it worked was to tax drivers to fund buses. So it's sort of the congestion charge was used to raise the funds to expand the bus network in London. And ultimately, I think in terms of policy, that's the way it has to go. Because if you're thinking about, okay, well, where's all the extra money coming from? It makes sense to tax the thing that you don't want to happen to invest in the thing that you do want to happen. Whereas I think a lot of people assume it's the other way around. They want the investment to come first without the stick. But when we look at the Scandinavian countries, carrot alone is not enough to get people to move away from car use. It's not just about giving people free public transport or giving people, subsidies in EVs. They help, but the key thing is the disincentivization of car use. That needs to happen alongside the others. And sometimes even first. Like it's not just give people free public transport and then they'll use public transport. Well, they won't if people's lean towards wanting more comfort for themselves and more convenience for themselves. So you have to disincentivize the car use to fund the public transport use.
Mm-hmm. I see. Okay, but I think it still presents a big challenge because many cities, even I'd say like trains are probably one of the most efficient means of travel. And some building new train stations is very expensive because let's say Birmingham again, in the wealthy areas, there's about 3 train stations close to each other. If you go to the poorer areas, like 5 miles, 3-4 miles apart, some of the train stations. And that's a key issue, which I think the council hasn't really addressed in a long time. And that's going to probably take decades for them to even build new train stations, create new lines. A lot of it may be down to unintelligent design as well and unintelligent policies. So over the last few years, I've seen changes being made to like reduce like lanes for cars, make cycle lanes and so on. But all they've really done is increase congestion because the buses are operating on the same lines the cars are now going into, and they haven't actually encouraged train use at all. The trains are actually quite derelict. People don't really use them that often, which if they did, there'd be a lot more reduction in traffic.
I mean, so there's 2 things there that I would say is, one, yes, trains are really expensive, What Birmingham has that London doesn't really have is trams. And trams are brilliant.
Birmingham has one tram.
They've got one tram. I've been on it.
In Manchester's a better example. Manchester, because you have these stop and go places, which are really, really cool.
Ultimately, what we did was we ripped out all the trams across the UK to make space for cars. So that's like, where did all the trams go? It's because, oh, we couldn't put a tram here because there's too many cars now. I would say the best way to remedy what you're doing and what you're talking about in the first instance is, again, what London did is put in bus priority lanes. So they are lanes that cars cannot go in, and it's just a bus lane, and it's to make the buses go faster. And people talk about, oh, if you're putting in a bus lane, where is the cycle lane going to go? And do these two users, are they pitted against each other in some way? And I would argue, no. What you need to do is make room for buses, make room for cycles, reduce space for cars. So I think always taking space away from cars. You're talking about that then increases congestion. It doesn't really, I mean, it increases congestion in a short space of time. Traffic isn't a fixed thing. So what happens is people will drive because it's the most convenient way for them to get about. People stop driving in inner London because it's not the most convenient way to get about. There's too much congestion. So lots of people actually now start using alternatives. And so it kind of goes up and it goes down and it goes up and it goes down. It's a cycle. So basically what you want to do is discourage people from using their cars, reduce the space allocated to cars, and because of the congestion, people will then say there's no point in me driving. It's faster to use the bus, it's faster to cycle. That's exactly what's happened in a lot of these other cities. In Tokyo, for example, it's the fastest way to get around is not by car. So you have to think about how do we make this the fastest way to get about? And I think rather than trains, which are costly, necessary, and if we have the investment, we should go for it. But in the short term, if you have reduced, if you don't have a lot of money, basically, putting bus priority lanes in and putting in something called rapid bus transits in, which are essentially which are just buses, and they run like trams, except they don't have, they're not electrified in the same way. They don't have the rail line to run along. They just jump around, but with a lane, it's the lane that gives you the speed you're looking for. And that's the cheap way of doing it.
Yeah, I think cities like Manchester, Oxford, they've done some really clever things where they've got these stop and go places on the outskirts. The people who are coming into the centre, they just park their cars at the stop and go, and get public transport into the city, which I think a place like Birmingham or it would be really wonderful, but unfortunately we haven't picked up on that yet.
Again, I would say it's a choice. So Manchester's very, very new to the game when it comes to their kind of tram network and their little B card. That's all really, really new. London's been doing it for a long time. But what needs to happen is, that's the other thing, that Manchester has a mayor who's been really good at campaigning for this and owning this project. Birmingham mayor is perhaps less excited. He's ideologically perhaps he's perhaps ideologically a bit more opposed to that kind of frame of thinking. And I think it's disappointing, and the electorate should hold him to account.
Yeah. There's other cities as well. Bristol, they're really even though they haven't got space, the roads are tiny. They managed to fit cycle lanes in everywhere.
Yeah.
And I think that's made a big difference, because you see plenty of cyclists in Bristol, and it's a hilly city as well. It's not like Birmingham, which is flat. It's a very hilly city, and people still cycle about quite a lot in Bristol, which I'm quite impressed by.
I think it's a lot to do with demographics as well. So Bristol is a fairly young city. It's it's a core uni city. And people are encouraged to cycle there, as in it becomes the norm. If you see other people cycling, it becomes more normal. As I'm cycling about, I know people look at me. I see lots of people looking at me because I am a relatively, I'm a younger brown woman, and that is a rare-ish sight in London. It's not impossible, but I know that by doing that, I'm setting an example for other people to be like, I can do it. and I don't wear a helmet. I don't have fancy cycling clothes. I'm usually just in my regular work clothes. I'm not the most confident of cyclists, but now that I've started doing it, the confidence comes as the more you do it. And so when people are talking about how it's really difficult to cycle, I'll grant you, without cycle lanes, it really is. And I'm not going to tell anyone to go out there and kind of, forget the cycle lanes, because I do think they're important in building confidence. But if you have cycle lanes by you, do go out on your bike for like a little spin and build your confidence, because you will notice I think genuinely it's one of the best ways to get about. It really, really is.
Yeah, cycling is quite fun.
It is.
When it's not raining. Yeah.
Even when it's raining, I think if you've got the right gear, if you've got a coat on, and you've got a hood on, it's always, so this is very old school mentality, but it's never the wrong weather. You're just wearing the wrong clothes.
People with glasses, right? When you cycle, the water droplets hit on your glasses, then you can't see properly. That's the main hindrance I find.
Really?
Yeah.
You just need like a hood that kind of comes over you so that the water's not getting at your eyes.
Yeah, maybe I need
or
to,
like a hat with like a cap to protect your eyes, I think.
Yeah, but fortunately, where I cycle, it's usually fairly dry on the times I go.
Yeah. Fair weather cyclist.
It's another question I want to ask. How do you balance multiple issues? Because you talked about, you got into it through public health, but there's a climate aspect of it, there's pollution aspect. People will also say, okay, let's say, for instance, let's take the ULEZ. I don't think it's a fair example, but let's just use it as an example. People will say, you're sacrificing economic, people are poor and they're already suffering, and then you're taking their cars away. I think you can always work around that, but there's always this economic prosperity versus sustainable or zero carbon priority as well. So how do you manage priorities like that?
I mean, I would kind of say that is I question the premise, because ultimately the poorest Londoners don't own cars. The poorest Londoners can't afford to own cars, so they walk and they use the bus mostly. And so when we have bus cuts, it is the poorest Londoners that suffer. It is often, women and carers who rely on bus infrastructure, and they're the ones who suffer. So when people talk about low-income people, it's sort of like, it's the question of who's the poorest, right? Are we talking about the real poorest end, or are we then saying, okay, well, what about this 10% who are better off than this, but they're not better off than that? I would say there's always going to be winners and losers in policy. And I believe in targeted help. So one of the things that I find frustrating about the ULEZ scrappage scheme is it experienced a lot of pressure because Sadiq Khan had targeted the help. He basically said, no, if you're on benefits, if you're really struggling, we'll give you money. He faced a lot of pressure. So now he's basically gone, right, whatever car you own, if it doesn't comply, we will give you money. Now, that's frustrating for me, because I'm like, you're basically giving money to people who, if I'm honest, don't need it. There might be some people in that group who benefit, but I think a lot more people are getting money that they don't deserve, when it could be going towards people really on the far end who rely on that bus infrastructure. So that's why I think fundamentally Sadiq Khan has basically now said, whatever car you own, if it doesn't comply, you can get money to get it scrapped. So that now you won't hear people talking about that. You won't hear people saying, oh, it's targeting the really poor who can't own a car and blah, blah, like that, because they have no leg to stand on at this point. But I think realistically, if you think about it from a policy perspective, was that the right? I think politically it was the right choice for him to win votes and to get this, he was facing a lot of pressure. But from a policy perspective, I don't think it's the right policy.
Okay. Earlier you mentioned that we've got about 6 years left to reduce the number of cars down by 25%, right?
Yeah.
And you probably know it's unlikely to happen, right? Realistically. So
I don't believe that.
You genuinely don't believe it's...
I don't believe it's unrealistic. With a
If you
new
had to make a bet on whether it would happen or not, your bet would probably be it won't happen.
Oh, I'm a woman of God, Hamza. I never bet, but I kind of think I think what the things required to make it happen are there. You know, like so like for me, it's not impossible. It would be like someone saying to me, "Oh, we have to build a really tall building." And can we do it in 6 years? And it's like, well, yeah, with enough people, with enough material, like the solutions are there. It's not like the solutions don't exist.
Yeah, the resources are available. Yeah.
Exactly. And so for me, it would be a lie to say it's impossible. Quite frankly, it would be a lie. It is possible, and you have to keep up political pressure to get it. And you have to, like I said, I think once you're aware. And I went on this journey as well. So I'm not lambasting anyone who isn't aware. But once you're aware of the lay of the land, the conversation does not then become about, oh, well, we're going to miss it. So then what happens? It's like, we have to meet these targets. Otherwise, millions and millions of people will die. That's the reality we're talking about. So do I think it's politically feasible to allow millions of people to die because people don't want to give up their cars? From a moral standpoint, no, I don't. I think that's unethical. It's immoral. It's wrong. And so as a person who is motivated by what is right, and what does God want of me, that's part of what drives the work that I do.
So it's that, okay, so the inherent belief that this is the mission orientation of what you're doing. But let's say, okay, let's take a different example then, not the cars. Let's say the CO2 targets, and right now we've surpassed 1.5 degrees warming, I think, in the planet. And let's say at 2 degrees you get feedback loops. So that's unlikely. Yeah. It's very unlikely we're not going to prevent that from happening, because 2 degrees is not very far away, and carbon stays suspended in the atmosphere for about 200 years. So any warming, we're probably going to trigger feedback loops. How do you stay like, how do you just live with the fact that despite our efforts, it's unlikely we're going to have a sustainable future? There's going to be damage to the planet to some degree, and which is going to harm people's lives. How do you cognizantly like think, okay, what I'm doing is still worth it and we should continue?
I think fundamentally it's a huge philosophical question here about what do you think is your role in the world? And I think for me, life is about the pursuit, right? It's about trying and doing all that you can. And even in the face of going, is this going to work? And I feel like, what are the conditions required to make it work? So I guess I'm less resigned to the fact that we're not going to be able to avert catastrophe. I am more, I kind of think about, so, there's 1.5 and then there's 2 degrees, but there's a lot of degrees in between 1.5 and 2. So before we let go of 1.5 and jump to 2, is it 1.55? Is it 1.6? Is it 1.65? Before, like, I think we should try our hardest to keep the fight going. And like I said, for me, what helps is knowing the, first of all, what helps is knowing that, I'm not alone in this. This is, a joint, a collective. It is the existence of humanity at stake here, and so there are a number of very clever people working on this issue. It is not on any one person's shoulder to fix climate change, like, for example. 2, it's knowing that God has a plan. So whatever works out, despite my efforts, whatever happens, God has planned it. And so that gives me reassurance in that there's not a real sense of losing, in that it's very, very sad for us personally as humans, but God has a greater plan in which we all fit into. And you have to kind of combine those two. You have to kind of say, put in the effort regardless of the result, or review your efforts and kind of think, are we doing this the wrong way? Are there other things we should be focusing on? But it's the answer is never give up. I would, I guess it's not in my nature, but it's also not something that I can advocate for given the circumstances we're working in.
And do you think your belief in God is, or your conviction in his plan is central to like keeping the fight going? For instance, if you do not believe, do you think you'd be a lot more defeatist?
Oh yeah, for sure. I think if I didn't believe, I one probably would doubt I would have the same desire to try. This is me personally. There are obviously people out there who don't believe in God and fight very hard for climate change. But for me personally, I think I would feel a bit more like, what is the point? I'm just one person. I don't need to try because my efforts are not being assessed in any way and they don't matter. Mm-hmm. So ultimately, I think it's very easy to become defeatist. I think knowing that God has a plan and whether I think it's, whether I can see the benefits of it or not, I feel comforted by the fact that this is God's plan and God knows all of the, God has all of the workings that I cannot hold. And so whatever God does is for God's purposes, which I believe are the best purposes.
Good, agreed. What can someone do, let's say, listen to this, even including myself actually, in addition to just like reducing our car usage, trying to cycle more and use public transport, what like political engagement, what can we do to encourage legislation or investment into making cities better for car alternatives?
Okay, here's something that I need to say that I think most people don't like to hear, but I think it's important that I say. The richest 10% of people need to reduce their carbon emissions. The richest 10% of people in the world. And who are the richest 10% of people in the world? Roughly, they're people who are earning around about the 25 to 30K mark per year. That's it. Now for Britain, we think that's quite low. We're like, oh, there are people on low end of the spectrum. In terms of the whole world, you're part of the richest 10%. So most of the people listening to this podcast, I bet a vast majority of them will fall into that richest 10%. And so personally, I'm talking to the richest 10%, you need to reduce your carbon emissions. You cannot continue to drive the way you do, wear the clothes you currently do in the same kind of a fast fashion type way, and consume meat in the way that we do because it is harming the environment. So the poorest 90% of the world, everyone else, we can say, okay, you personally probably can't reduce your carbon emissions. You're probably not even contributing to carbon emissions that much, but the richest 10% are. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing is, yes, learn more about the climate crisis and the various ways it affects your life. And this isn't going to happen overnight. This is a very slow, it might happen over a year or over 2 years. Pick an issue that you think I could do more on. And realistically, we could all do more on. I could 100% do more on. And really evaluate where your morals stand on a particular issue. Build your knowledge and start advocating. So you can write to your MPs, you can speak to your council. I feel like councils get off really lightly. Many people don't pay attention to their council, but councils have a lot of power in England. Write to your local councils about what they could be doing in terms of their waste, in terms of energy efficiency, in terms of, parking in your local area. And I think, really advocate for change. That's how change happens, is by politicians and people in power thinking, oh, I'm getting a lot of, people talking to me about this issue. People really care about this issue. I need to do something about it. And that is what I mean about everyone thinking that we're in a crisis. So what happened with COVID was everyone, or, a vast majority of people decided that we had to do something at the risk of everyone else. that's the stage we need to get to with the climate crisis.
Wow. Okay, that's a lot. Even the richest 10%, that's more or less everyone who lives in the UK, every adult basically.
Most people in the
Yeah.
UK.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's what I mean about, so I don't think we have the resources for everyone to live like we do, but we do have the resources in the world for everyone to live a sustainable life that nourishes them and nourishes their families and their communities. So I think it does require a shift, which we're currently so used to talking about more and more and more and more, to actually saying more for what? Like, like what is enough and what is sustainable? It's this whole idea of donut economics. What can the world sustain with using the world's resources in a sustainable way?
Yeah, interesting that there was a study by Oxfam, I think, and they said that the world's richest 1%, actually, not 10%, 1% produce double the CO2 emissions of the poorest 50%. So a lot more, I think, of the focus should actually be on taxation of billionaires, because their lifestyles are infinitely more damaging than people on 25 to 30K, because the private jets and the business flights especially, and just the overall consumption is much larger.
I think for me, yes, tax billionaires more. And personally, my personal views are it's unethical to be a billionaire in the economy, because the way you would have become a billionaire is basically through exploitation. There is no way of becoming a billionaire without the exploitation of other people's work. That's my personal philosophy. But I know that just focusing on billionaires is not enough to get the change that we need, because under billionaires there are also millionaires, there are also just generally wealthy people. And even if you're not wealthy, like I'm saying, your lifestyle, likely what you consider to be normal, is probably far more carbon intensive than the 90% of the rest of the world. And we have to seriously look at the way we live our lives, which, and I see it in my own family, I see it in my own life, is not a kind of ethical way of consuming carbon. And of course we are bound by the structures we live in, but we have to be making an effort to fight those structures, change those structures, and build new ones.
Yeah, like even in the UK, people on 25, 30, 40K, men, we eat too much meat, and women's fast fashion, like Boohoo and all these providers or shops.
Yeah.
It's really damaging. Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much, Hirra, for giving me your time. I've learned a lot. I'm sure anyone else listening has learned a lot as well. So thank you for coming on.
It's been great chatting to you. Thank you so much. Thanks for your time.